Hey everyone! In this video, I'm going to show you how to knit the head and tail of a fox. The techniques and stitches you'll need for this animal are stockinette, basic increases and decreases, mattress stitch for the seams, moss stitch for the ears, and fur loop stitch for the tail. The optional beard or white part of the fox's nose uses intarsia. The moss stitch on the ears can be a little tricky, but I'll walk you through how to do each row of the ears in this video. I'll also walk you through the fur loop stitch for the tail and the intarsia for the beard. You'll need about 4 ounces of DK or sport weight yarn, or about 3 to 4 times that if you're using a bulky weight yarn like what I'm using in this video. I've chosen to give my fox a white belly and beard and long dark socks on its legs. So about 1/4 of my yarn needs to be in the white color and then just a little bit of a dark brown or black color for the feet. You'll also need about 1 yard of darker contrast yarn for the eyes and nose. Use knitting needles that are at least 2 sizes smaller than what's recommended for the yarn you're using. The yarn I'm using asks for size 13 needles, so I'm using size 11 needles in this video. Some other things you'll need are stuffing, scissors, a tapestry needle, and some type of row counter so that you can keep track of which row you're on. With each of my animals, I like to include a list of that animal's attributes. Fox's attributes are independent, unique, sensitive, playful, friendly, curious, sweet-tempered, athletic, and communicative. Just a few more things before I get to the pattern. Don't let my knitting style throw you off. Just knit and purl in the way that's most comfortable for you. Please like and share my videos and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Click Show More in the description area for links to more videos and information. Share photos of your completed project on my Facebook page. You can find a link for that in the description area too. And finally, if you'd like a written pattern, I've given links to the shops where I sell them in the description area as well. This video focuses only on the head and tail. All of my animals use the same body and leg patterns, so I've made separate videos for those pieces. If you haven't knitted them yet, you can find links to those pattern videos in the description. And remember that if you want a fox with a white belly, you need to follow the video for the different colored stomach. And if you want your fox to have long colored socks, like I have here, begin knitting the basic legs in the orange color and then change to the dark color at row 13. Because the fox's leg coloring doesn't transition smoothly, I also like to embroider a few stitches on row 12 using duplicate stitch. If you like to do this, just be sure to leave a very long tail of the dark color when you change color. Then you can use that long tail to embroider the extra stitches and you won't have so many ends to tie off or weave in when you're done. I'm going to be demonstrating the fox with the optional white beard in this video, so I'll explain which stitches should be done in white and which should be done in orange. If you're doing the simpler version without the beard, you won't need to change back and forth, but you'll stay in orange throughout. The optional beard uses intarsia, so before we start, make sure you have a second length of orange yarn that's long enough for about 40 stitches. I like to just use the other end of the yarn whenever that's possible. And if you're not familiar with the intarsia technique, you might want to review how to do it and practice doing it for a few rows before using it on your animal. Okay, let's get started with the head. Cast on 6 stitches in black for the nose. On row 1, change to the color of the head and be sure to leave a long tail for sewing with later. If you're doing the optional beard, then you should purl across on row 1 with white. If you're doing the simpler head without the color changes, then just purl across with orange. And remember that my style of knitting might look a little strange, but you can do the knit and purl stitches in the way that you like best. On row 2, knit 2 and increase once. Do that 2 times. I like to increase with what's often called a make one by knitting into the stitch below the one on the right needle, and then knit the final 2. When you're done, you should have 8 stitches. Purl across on row 3. On row 4, knit the first 2 and then repeat the pattern of knit 1 and increase 1. Do that 4 times. Then knit the final 2 and you should have 12 stitches. Purl across on row 5. On row 6, knit the first 2 and then begin the pattern of knitting 1 and increasing 1 across to the last 2 stitches, which you'll just knit. If you're knitting the beard, then switch to orange on the middle 4 stitches, and those are the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th stitches on this row. Then switch back to white for the final 8 stitches. And when you're done, you should have 20 stitches. Purl across on row 7, and if you're doing the beard, then switch to orange for the middle 6 stitches. So on this row and every following row, we're going to widen the number of orange stitches by 1 on each side. And each time you switch to a new color, remember to wrap or twist the old and new colors so that you won't have any holes. Remember to twist the old color over the top of the new color. The rule I like to remember for intarsia is twist the old over the new. So twist the old color over the top of the new color. Remember as you're doing intarsia to give a slight tug after you do the wraps so that the new yarn has the same tension as the old yarn. Don't pull it too tightly, but you also don't want it to be too loose. On row 8, knit the first 7 and then follow the pattern of knitting 1 and increasing 1. Do that 6 times and remember to widen the number of orange stitches by 1 on each side and then knit the final 7 stitches. You should have 26 stitches at the end of row 8 and the 14 middle stitches should be orange if you're working the beard. Purl across on row 9, remembering to widen the orange color by 1 on each side, so you should have 16 orange stitches in the middle now. On row 10, knit the first 5 and then follow the pattern of knitting 1 and increasing 1. Do that 4 times. And remember to widen the number of orange stitches by 1 on each side as you go. Then just knit the next 8 stitches without doing any increases. Then repeat the pattern of increase 1 and knit 1 4 times, and then knit the final 5 stitches. And you should have 34 stitches. And only the 4 stitches at the beginning and 4 stitches at the end of the row should be white at this point. Purl across on row 11, and if you're doing the beard, only the 3 stitches at the beginning and 3 stitches at the end should be white now. Knit across without any increases on row 12, and now the first 2 and last 2 stitches should be white. Purl across on row 13, and if you're doing the beard, all but the first and last stitch should be orange now. From row 14, all of your stitches should be orange, so you can cut the white yarn on both ends. Knit the first 2 stitches and then follow the pattern of knit 2 and increase 1 across till 4 stitches remain. Then knit those last 4 stitches without increasing. When you're done, you should have 48 stitches. Rows 15 through 22 are simple stockinette without any increases, decreases, or color changes. So go ahead and purl on the wrong sides and knit on the right sides for those rows, and I'll meet you back here when you're ready to work row 23. On row 23, we start decreasing at the back of the head. So purl the first 3 and then purl 2 together. Then the pattern is purl 6 and purl 2 together. Do that till you get to the last 3 stitches and then just purl them. And when you're done, you should have 42 stitches. Knit across on row 24. On row 25, purl the first 2 and then purl 2 together. Then the pattern is purl 5 and purl 2 together, and follow that pattern till you get to the last 3 stitches and then purl them. And at the end of this row you should have 36 stitches. Knit across on row 26. On row 27, purl the first 2, then the pattern is purl 2 together and purl 1, and follow that pattern to the last stitch and then purl it. And at that point you should have 25 stitches. Knit across on row 28. On row 29, purl the first stitch and then purl 2 together. Do that across to the last 2 and purl those individually. And you should have 14 stitches when you're done. Knit across on row 30. And row 31 is the last row. So purl the first stitch and then purl 2 together across to the last stitch and then just purl it. And you should have 8 stitches when you're done. Don't cast off here. Instead, cut your yarn, leaving enough to sew the seam and to attach the head to the body later. Thread this tail onto a tapestry needle, and then carefully thread the tail back through each stitch on the needle. Just to be safe, I like to thread the tail through those same stitches once more, and pull tight to make a nice closure. Now sew the bottom head seam a little less than halfway from the back to the neck at the bottom of the head. Next, take the tail that you left at your cast-on edge and weave this through the cast-on stitches and then sew up the head seam, leaving a wide enough opening at the bottom where you can stuff the head. Whenever I do intarsia, I like to tie the beginning and ending tails together and then use them to sew up any holes or wide spaces that are left. Normally, you wouldn't want to tie ends together because the knots would show, but since these knots will be hidden on the inside of the animal with all the stuffing, it's an easy way to secure the ends. and that finishes up the main headpiece. Now let's knit the ears. I like to use moss stitch for the fox's ears because it's one of the few stitches that looks the same on both the front and the back, and that allows the ear to be made in a single layer. Whenever I need to knit two of the same item, I like to knit them both at the same time so that I make sure they're consistent. And this is especially true with these ears because the decreases and moss stitch can get confusing. It's also especially important to know which row you're on and whether it's an even or odd numbered row, so you especially want to have a row counter at this point. For moss stitch, the basic rule I use is, on even rows, purl into the purled stitches and knit into the knit stitches as you do in stockinette. But I like to remember that on odd rows, because they're odd, I need to knit into the purled stitches and purl into the knitted stitches. So just keep that rule in mind as we knit each row. Start by casting on 13 for each ear, and remember to leave a good tail for sewing with later. Row 1 is our foundation row, so knit 1 and purl 1, follow that pattern across to the end. Row 2 is an even row, so now just purl into the first stitch where you can see the purl stitch below, and knit into the next stitch where you can see the V of the knitted stitch below. Continue knitting into knitted stitches and purling into the purled stitches just as if you were creating a K1 P1 ribbing. Now row 3 is an odd row, and remember that on odd rows we do opposite of what you'd normally want to do. So purl into the knitted V's and knit the purled stitches from the prior row. On row 4, knit 1, purl 1, and then knit 1 and purl 1 again, and then knit 1, and then purl the next 3 stitches together. It can be a little tricky purling 3 together, so just take your time and be sure you've got your needle through all 3 stitches. Then knit 1 and purl 1 2 times again, and then knit the final stitch. And you should have 11 stitches. Row 5 is an odd row, so purl into the knitted V's and knit the purled stitches from the prior row. On row 6, purl 1 and knit 1 twice, and then purl the next 3 stitches together. Then knit 1 and purl 1 2 times again, and you should have 9 stitches. Row 7 is an odd row, so purl into the knitted stitches and knit into the purls from the prior row. On row 8, knit 1, purl 1, and then knit 1. Then purl the next 3 stitches together. Then knit 1 and purl 1 and knit 1. And you should have 7 stitches. Row 9 is an odd row, so purl into the knits and knit into the purls. On row 10, purl 1 and then knit 1, and then purl the next 3 stitches together, then knit 1 and purl the final stitch, and you should have 5 stitches now. Row 11 is odd again, so purl into the knits and knit into the purls. On row 12, knit 1 and then purl the next 3 stitches together, then knit the final stitch, and you should have 3 stitches. On row 13, knit 1, purl 1, and knit 1. On row 14, slip the first stitch and then do a right decrease, which is often called an SSK, and then pass that first slip stitch over as if you were binding off. Now you should only have 1 stitch left. Cut the yarn and pull it through the last stitch, leaving enough to sew with later. Then thread this tail down through the back and middle of the ear. When we're ready to assemble the head, we'll sew the ears to the head using these leftover tails. The tail uses the fur loop stitch, which can take some time to get the hang of. If you haven't already, I recommend that you practice doing the first stitch before you begin doing it on your animal. Here's a quick overview of how to work the fur loop stitch. To make a fur stitch, start as if you're doing a normal knitted stitch, but don't pull the stitch off the needle as you normally would. Instead, hold the needle so that the stitch you just knitted into is still on the left needle, and the stitch you just made is stretched across on the right needle. Then bring the yarn between these two stretch stitches. Make a loop in front of the work by wrapping the yarn around your thumb, and then bring the yarn back up between the two needles again and back to the back of the work again. With the working yarn held at the back and the loop held at the front with your thumb, slip the stitch on the right needle back next to the stitch still being held on the left needle. Then knit both of these stitches together through their back legs. This twists the stitches and locks the loop in place. I like to give each loop a slight tug to tighten anything that's just a little loose. In most cases, you only work a fur stitch on every third stitch, and the rest of the stitches should be simply knitted. Just remember on the following rows to stagger the fur stitches by adding or subtracting a simple knit stitch so that you don't have one fur loop stitch directly above a fur stitch on the prior rows. The fur stitches are only worked on the right or knit side, and the purl rows are simply purled as normal. And now we're ready for the tail. We're going to start at the little white tip at the end of the fox's tail, and we won't start the first stitch until row 6. So cast on 13 in white and leave a long tail that you can use to sew with later. Purl across on row 1. On row 2, follow the pattern of knit 2 and increase 1. Follow that pattern across to the last stitch and then just knit it. And when you're done, you should have 19 stitches. Purl across on row 3. On row 4, follow the pattern of knit 3 and increase 1 across to the last stitch and then knit it. When you're done, you should have 25 stitches. Purl across on row 5. On row 6, we're going to begin working the first stitch on every third stitch. As a reminder, to work the fur loop stitch, knit into the stitch without pulling the stitch off the needle, pull the yarn between the two needles and make a loop around your thumb, bring the yarn back to the back again, slip the stitch on the right needle over to the left needle, knit the next 2 stitches through the back legs, and then tug lightly on each loop to tighten it up. Purl across on row 7. Knit across on row 8, working first stitch on every third stitch, and to make sure the stitches are staggered, this time begin working the first stitch on the second stitch of row 8. Purl across on row 9. Remember that on the wrong sides, we just simply purl. The fur loop stitches only go on the knitted rows. Knit across on row 10, working a loop stitch on every third stitch. This time, to make the stitches staggered, we need to begin working the first loop stitch on the 4th stitch of the row. On row 11, change to the orange color and then purl across. Knit across on row 12, working the loop stitch on the third stitch and then every third stitch after that. Continue working stockinette with the staggered first stitches until you get to row 31. You'll work all these rows in the orange color, so go ahead and work those rows, and I'll meet you back here when you're ready to work row 31. On row 31, purl the first stitch and then purl 2 together. Continue that pattern across to the last stitch and then purl it. You'll have 17 stitches when you're done with this row. Knit across with the staggered first stitches on row 32. On row 33, purl the first stitch and then purl 2 together. Continue that pattern across to the last 2 stitches and then purl them. And you'll have 12 stitches when you're done with this row. Knit across again with the staggered first stitches on row 34. Now continue working stockinette with staggered first stitches on the knit rows until you get to row 40. So go ahead and work these rows, and I'll meet you back here when you're ready to work row 40. We stopped working the fur loop stitches on row 40, so just knit across without working any fur stitches on this row. Purl across on row 41. Knit across on row 42 without any fur loop stitches. And then bind off and purl on row 43. Cut your yarn, leaving enough to sew with later. You'll sew the tail into position on the back near the widest part of the body. And now let's assemble the head. By the way, I have separate videos for knitting the body, arms and legs, and assembly, so in this video, I'm focusing only on the head. Grab some scissors, a tapestry needle, some stuffing, and a scrap of darker yarn for the eyes and nose. First, stuff the head through the little hole you left at the bottom of the head. Be careful not to add so much that it makes the stitches spread. And then sew the ears to the left and right sides of the top and back of the head. Sew the inner edges about 5 stitches apart from each other and leave about 4 stitches between the inner and outer edge of each ear. And now let's add the eyes. For most animals, the eyes look best below the forehead and closer to the nose. I like to sew the eyes about 3 stitches above the last white row, and then sew them about 4 to 5 stitches apart from each other. A French knot works well for the eyes. Pull the yarn out at the position where you want the eye. Then stick your needle back in through that same hole and come back out 1 stitch away. Don't pull the yarn all the way through, but leave a little loop that you can stick your needle into. Pull the loop snug, but not too tight, against the needle, and then, while holding it in place, wrap the yarn 5 to 6 times around the needle. The more wraps you have here, the larger your eyes will be. But the more loops you have, the harder they are to manage and create an eye with a clean edge. Then hold the loop and wraps carefully with one hand as you pull the needle and yarn through them, creating a little circle of loops. To secure the little circle of loops into position, I like to add a couple more loops by stitching close near the bottom of the eye on the head and then coming back out through the center of the loops. I like to do this a few times until the eye feels secure on all sides. Follow these same steps to add the second eye about 4 to 5 stitches apart from the first. And now we can sew the rest of the bottom head seam. Find the original yarn that was used to sew the head seams, and then stuff all the other straggling ends inside the head. Then finish sewing the seam, leaving just an end of yarn for sewing the head to the body later. And here's how the fox looks when it's all done. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to my channel so you can get notified when I release new animal and clothing patterns. And share a photo of your completed project on my Facebook page. See you next time!